Again, welcome to Symposiacs Vodcast. And I know it's been a month since the last time we actually did it. And we were talking about open and relational theology the last time we met. But what I'm going to try to do here is we're going to probably, I don't know if we're just going to stop talking about open and relational theology because, not meeting for about a month broke the continuity, right, in our discussion. But we're almost done with that book. And I think we discussed, the major points of open and relational theology. And so it's probably a good time to actually start with something new. Okay, and so for this evening, I wanted to just ask the question: what should basic theological education for lay leaders be? What should it be? Now, the reason why I'm asking this question because we have members of our church who are inquiring about basic theological education. And what I noticed is that many of them actually do not really know. Um, they don't really know what exactly is theological education. And so I wanted to have this conversation with Laurence here because we have some background in theological education, whether formal or informal, and probably we can try to answer that question. And we're going to be answering some other related questions here, but that will be the main question that I wanted to cover for tonight. Um, so. Um, so I'm here again with my co-host here, Laurence Gonzaga. He's a Roman Catholic friend of mine, and so we will be coming from different perspective here. I have this, evangelical conception of theological education, right? Protestant, probably more evangelical, because that's my background. And so, what I wanted to do before we start asking questions here, I wanted to see if Laurence and I, right, can probably say something about our exposures to theological education, so that at least you have some idea what kind of background we have when it comes to theological education. Go ahead, Laurence. I'll let you start.
Well, theological education. So, I had my basic Catholic initiation, as we call it in Catholicism. So, rites of initiation, things like that. I was baptized as a child, right? And so I didn't get sort of for a formal education. So I went to Catholic school in Glendale, California, Holy Family. I went to Catholic school there from second grade, third grade. And so I got my first communion preparation there, and so we had, and also we had daily catechism. So it's more than what a normal child would get from Sunday school, I guess they would call it, or catechism class, something like that. So because we had religion class at the Catholic school, so I had that kind of basic foundation, I guess you can say. But really, after that, it relied on whatever I got from my family, and it wasn't that much, to be honest with you, because we were sporadically church going. My grandparents were, but my parents were not so much. So I really didn't get much in the way of theology until after I converted or reverted after atheism. I was an atheist in my late teen years, and then college initially. And so when I went to get, when I reverted back to Catholicism, eventually I started studying apologetics. And so part of my private personal study of apologetics came sort of the theology embedded along with that, right? Because theology, generally speaking, is the study of God and the things of God. So that includes certainly apologetics. And so when you're trying to defend doctrines that are particular to Catholicism, like the papacy or the sacraments, confession, communion, like the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, that has, along with it, a lot of the foundational theological ideas that you would get as a Catholic, I guess you could say. It touches on the atonement. What did Christ do on the cross? Why did Christ even come? What is he saving us from, right? What is original sin? What is sin? Why do people go to hell? If they do go to hell, and how do you get to heaven for those who do go to heaven? Do you have to do stuff? Or is it just a belief, just kind of an assent of faith? And what is faith, right? Is it a gift? Is it something you do? Is it something you initiate? Or is it something that God initiates and you respond? Or is it all God and we're just kind of puppets? All of those ideas just came along with the thirst for more and more information and knowledge, for understanding, by way of apologetics. That's kind of my entree into theology, was in the world of apologetics. And then I became a catechist. I became a teacher for the Catholic Church officially, or the local church. And I've been doing that kind of ever since, informally, as a private person, doing YouTube videos and things like that. I got attached to an author who was recognized in the Catholic Church, has written several books, Dr. Robert Sungenis. So, working for him also, I absorb all of, I shouldn't say all of his knowledge, because I don't think I can ever hold a candle to what he's done in his work. But just by being in his proximity has helped me to gain more and more knowledge. And also, I have a lot of connections with other apologists and other authors, Dr. Scott Hahn, the folks at Catholic Answers in San Diego, Jerry Matitix, who's a former friend of, sort of Scott Hahn. So he's a well-known back in the day apologist. That's a long answer to your question, but that's kind of, my way of, being in the sphere of theology, even while never formally getting a degree. I mean, I went to school at Fuller Theological Seminary for one semester, but that was for psychology. But there was theology in there as it relates to psychology. So, part of the reason why I left there is I just didn't feel like there was a cohesive, unified theological perspective. It's a very liberal sort of hodgepodge of very different views of theology. On the one end of the spectrum, you have conservative, sort of reformed, folks, but then on the opposite side, you have, Mennonite, kind of, theology. So it was just it was so vastly, differential from each other that it was hard for me as a Catholic, who, you would have to have some kind of monolithic theological worldview for your whole system to make sense as a Catholic. That's just the way it is. That doesn't mean that there isn't a wide variety of Catholics and Catholics who share their opinion. But as far as those who really understand what Catholicism is about, is really being, there's a phrase, sentiri cum ecclesia, thinking with the church, thinking with the mind of the church, and not just the mind of the church of today, but the mind of the church throughout 2,000 years of history, right? So what has been constant and been taught, not just in one place, but in all places, constantly. And we also call that the Vincentian Canon. Vincent of Laurence said, what you hold as a Catholic, as a Christian, should be what has been held everywhere in all places throughout the centuries, throughout all, since the beginning of Christianity. And that's a good kind of litmus test. It's not infallible. It's not always easy to figure out what has always been held throughout the centuries and everywhere in every place. But that's why the Church Fathers is very important. You gotta, and that's a huge, what is it, a 40 volume set if you buy the Church Fathers. So I mean, how can you absorb? It's hard enough to absorb the Bible, let alone 40 volumes of Church Fathers, right? So, anyway, that's a sort of long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. Actually, I wanted to point out three things that I think was interesting about what you said. One is you considered, your engagement in church practices as part of your theological formation. Am I correct? I think that's very
Yeah,
interesting to point out. That I think many Protestants probably, or at least many evangelicals probably, I don't know if they really see it that way, but I think that's expected from a Catholic to somehow say something like that, and I think that's
yeah,
a good thing. Another thing is when you pointed out about mentorship. You were mentored by some people, Sungenis and is the one that you mentioned a while ago, Scott Hahn,
mm,
probably
true,
indirectly, right, by Scott Hahn.
right, right,
But you were mentored by people, and I think even when you look at theological formation in the early church, right, it really has a lot to do with being mentored, right, by the bishops, right, by the leaders of the church. So mentorship. So what I'm doing in the church when I'm preaching, teaching, right? I'm trying to mentor some people, right? So mentorship is part of theological formation. And there's a third thing that I think you said that I also find interesting. What is that third thing here? Oh yeah, about the kind of education that you the kind of education that you observed, right, at Fuller Seminary, right? Because Fuller Seminary is an interdenominational seminary, right? So it is expected that people are actually coming from very different traditions, right?
mm,
And so the diversity there is probably something that you can also expect from like University of Notre Dame theology department, let's say, or Boston College, right, theology department, right? So it might be you might expect of something very similar, right, where faculty members are going to be diverse, right, in so many ways. And probably you'll get that even at the Jesuit School of Theology, right, at Santa Clara University. Now, so for me, my theological exposure also, I think I get this from initially from reading books as a kid, reading theology books. So that's the informal aspect of it. And then also the kind of, you learn by doing things. So I started teaching Bible studies, preaching, right, as a teenager. So that in itself, I can consider that to be an informal part of my theological formation. What else? I attended a Bible college in the Philippines, a very small Bible college in the Philippines, for about a semester or a year, and I learned some stuff there. So that's part of my exposure to theological education. I went to a Christian college, so this is definitely a different path from Lawrence, right? So because that's more formal. Even though I was a philosophy major, I almost had a minor in theology because pretty much if you go to a Christian college, if they don't have a very strong philosophy department, then what you get is that philosophy courses are taught by theologians. And that's most of my experiences as an undergraduate is that philosophy classes, many of the philosophy classes I took were actually taught by theologians. And so whether you like it or not, then what you're really getting is some kind of theological education, right? Because somehow everything boils down to God at some point, right? That's not how philosophy is supposed to be taught, right? At least in the modern world, right? But that's how I was, exposed formally to, theological education. It's by majoring in philosophy and taking philosophy courses from theologians. So that's my initial experience. And then, of course, I attended a seminary. But the kind of education I got in the seminary is very different because I attended a divinity school. A divinity school, like usually, it's a theological institution that is actually affiliated with a big university. So So that means you have a different kind of resources there. And but in the divinity school that I attended, there are two tracks, right? So you can go ministerial track, and then so that means you have to get your Masters of Divinity, like if you want to be a pastor. But I didn't take that route. I actually took the academic route. So I went to a seminary pursuing some kind of an academic degree, right? So I got my master's degree in philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. So it's actually mostly about philosophy, but I also took theology and Bible courses. So if you will combine the kind of classes that I took as an undergrad and in the seminary, the theology and the Bible classes, then I think I have adequate um, formal courses, right, that have something to do with theological education. And then when I pursued my PhD, it was I also wrote my paper on Kant and natural theology, in particular ontological proof. So that has something to do with religion again. So I'm assuming that, and then even though I was a philosopher, I'm always thinking about theology, right? And that's why even all of my folio papers have something to do with religion. And so writing those three folio papers, so I wrote a paper on self-deception and religious belief, right? I wrote a paper on politics and religion, and I wrote another paper on Kant and natural theology, right? So all of those have something to do with religion. So I would consider them to be, so the whole time I was in school, that I was going through what we can properly call theological education, even though I was actually a philosophy major pretty much the whole time. Okay. Because for me, I can't separate philosophy from theology. And so I got interested in philosophy because of theology. So that's my exposure. And then of course, pastoring, preaching, so that in itself, you gain some kind of theological education. Now, so we do have some kind of exposure to theological education, but what we want to focus on here is actually theological education for lay leaders, right? And so when we think about, there's a difference between people in ordained or licensed ministry, right, and lay ministry. I think it's the same for Catholic Church and the same for Protestant churches. Am I correct? Right. So the priest is part of the ordained ministry, right? In the
Right.
Protestant churches, you get license and then you get the ordination. So licensing, that's the first thing you have to aim for, right? And then that's the time you're gaining some kind of experience how to pastor. And then once you get adequate experience, like I don't know, 3 5 years of pastoring ministry, then they treat you as being ready to go for ordination. So different Protestant churches
Mhm.
have different requirements, but our concern here is about lay ministry. So these are mostly like volunteer work. These are people who are not doing ministry full time, right? So these are people who are actually helping the priest, helping the pastor, right, lead the church.
Could
Go
I
ahead.
add an important distinction here?
Okay.
For those who don't, even if you're former Catholic, you might, and you left and you became Protestant or something, right? You might not have a full understanding of what the priesthood is, and you might think it's just kind of a Catholic version of what the Protestant pastor is. But I mean, all you have to do is spend 10, 15 minutes in a Catholic mass if you're Protestant to just know it's not the same thing. I mean, it's more. It's not preaching, right? So preaching is maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes out of a Catholic mass. So a Catholic would say that the focus of the mass is not the preaching. you can have terrible preaching and still say what a beautiful Catholic mass that was. He might not be the greatest orator, right? But you wouldn't say, oh, that was a terrible service, right? You wouldn't say that, because the focus of a Catholic worship is the sacraments, right? And so when you go to Catholic mass, it's the Catholic believes that the priest primarily, if he does nothing else, is to offer the sacrifice of Christ on the cross on the altar, and that's the Eucharist, right? And so it is that hocus pocus stuff that for those who are outsiders might not really understand what it's about. So it's not, the focus is not the social aspect or even, leading the congregation. That's all secondary to the ceremonials of the Catholic liturgy. So so in that sense, everything apart from that is lay. I mean, you can have lay preachers. I mean, that's why you have so many of these Catholic apologists. They're that's their ministry is the preaching. They can be preachers, but they're not in the same sense. Like you can even get an MDiv as a lay person. Like you could go to seminary as a Catholic priest, and then you don't end up getting ordained. But then you still have your MDiv. So what can you do? You could still preach. You could still be a deacon. You could still do all sorts of other things. Mm-hmm. And even deacons are technically ordained, right? But they're still lay people in the sense that they're not priests. Mm-hmm. I don't know if any of this is helpful distinctions, but it's just it's really just a different kind of world.
Because that I think the same thing you can say about the Eastern Orthodox churches, right?
Oh,
Eastern
yeah,
Orthodox
right.
Church, very similar. You look at the Anglicans, right? Less focus on preaching as well, right?
That's true.
Usually liturgical churches are like that.
Yeah, even the Lutherans, like the Missouri Synod Lutherans.
Yeah. So there are a lot of liturgies, right? But for the other side of a more Protestant side, right, of um, of Christianity, right, the focus or the center is actually on the preaching, right, rather than on the rituals, the liturgies, right. So the focus is on preaching. But when I say lay leaders in the church, I'm just talking about people who really just help the pastor, right? The local pastor. They probably teach Bible studies, right? Or teach adult Sunday school classes or teaching children, right? So the kind of theological training that you might need is of course not, it doesn't have to be as rich and as robust as the ones that pastors should get, right? And there are people who are just going to be just local pastors. I think in United Methodist Church, they have what they call, local pastors. So they're not going to be transferred from one church to another, but they are just simply assigned, right, to serve as a lay leader for that particular, or a pastor for that particular church, right? So I think it's still part of the lay ministry, but they're still required to have some kind of theological education. Okay. And so the next thing I wanted to ask here is this. Um, um, so before we move here, or so let me just ask this question: why even lay leaders need to have theological education, and why is theological education even important? I'll let you answer that first. I don't know if that is deemed important. I'm assuming it's deemed important
Yeah.
in the Catholic Church, right?
Well, yes,
Mhm,
it's important because of the times that we're in and the
mhm,
crisis that Catholics who are in the know would talk about in today's age, and that is,
mhm,
well, before the Second Vatican Council, you had, well, okay, let me just start out. In the United States, you would see this since Catholics started being a force to be reckoned with in the United States, you would have a steady and really exponential growth of Catholics in general, but also nuns and priests, colleges being started, schools, exponential growth since the Catholics started coming to the United States and settling, right? And that actually came to a pinnacle, I guess, an apex, right at the Second Vatican Council, and sharply started declining after the Second Vatican Council. And the reasons for that is debatable, but nevertheless, that's the main reason why the role of the laity in the Catholic Church today has grown exponentially, because there's been such a huge decline in ordained ministry. So seminaries closing, seminarians leaving the seminary, priests leaving the priesthood since the Second Vatican Council. And so even while there's an increase slightly in vocations since the pontificate of John Paul II, you still have not enough priests to so you would have, what is it, just in this diocese, I think the ratio is something like you have one priest to like 10,000 people or something like that, something ridiculous, right? One priest, right? So and again, the emphasis is on the sacramental life of the church. And so, and the priest for the most part is the one that does most of those sacraments. Well, I shouldn't say most of those sacraments. I'm just saying the primary ones require the ministry of priests, not just lay people. So, so why is it important? Because lay people have to fill in the gaps where you had, unpaid, really, priests and nuns doing the teaching and doing all that stuff. Now the nuns are gone. There's no nuns anymore that are teaching the school. So you have these lay people teaching catechism, teaching at the Catholic schools, and they have to pay salaries. They have to pay them salaries to support their families, and it's not always a living wage, to be honest. So they need to have that theological foundation, because if they're going to teach religion, they need to have the basics, whatever those basics are. They need to understand it well themselves, to be able to pass that on. Just like that, what is it in the scripture that says there are many things in St. Peter and Peter's epistles. He said there are many things in Paul's letters that are confusing, and it is leading folks to interpret things to their own destruction, something along those lines. Yeah. Right. And the Greek word there, I forget what the Greek word is, but it means untaught. The person is untaught. So what is the implication? Somebody needs to be taught properly. So whoever is the authorized person to teach needs to guide that next generation, that next person that's going to then pass on that faith. And so you need theological, there needs to be some institution, whatever it is, a college or a seminary, that's going to prepare the individual to with whatever proper doctrines or ways of interpreting the scriptures or whatever it is, to pass it on.
Yeah.
I just answer your question.
That actually answered the question. So, and I think for me, if I asked myself that question, why even lay leaders need to have theological education, and why is theological education important? Because one of the reasons why the church exists is it exists as a bearer of the truth or divine truths. In a way, we're supposed to have the task of preserving, right, the divine truth from one generation to the next. That's not the only task, right? I don't want to say that we have to reduce everything that we have to do, right, to that. Because there are other things that you have to do, social action, right, social justice, whatever. But definitely the preservation of the truth that was once passed on to the saints, right? Again, the goal is supposed to be passing it on from one generation to the next. And given that these are ideas, right, in a huge marketplace of ideas, So that means this divine truths must compete with other truth claims, right, or claims to truth, right, from different views, different perspectives. And that's the reason why you need theological education, because you need to find ways to preserve, protect what has been supposedly, right, entrusted to the saints, and what is supposed to be passed on from one generation to the next. Like what I said, that's one of the reasons why the church exists. So that means if we fail at that, right, then we're actually stripping ourselves, one of the reasons, right, why we're supposed to be in existence, right? That's not a sufficient reason for our existence, but that's definitely a necessary condition, right, for our very existence as a church. I don't know if does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Was it First Timothy 3:15?
yeah,
2 Timothy 3:15.
yeah,
The pillar and foundation of the truth is a church.
yeah.
Right. So, what is the truth? I mean, even from a Protestant perspective, when you watch some debates between Protestants and Catholics, the Catholics would say, "See, the church is the pillar and foundation of the truth. So that's where you go as for the So the truth is the bearer of truth is the church. So you can't leave the institution." But then the Protestant side would say, "Well, what is a pillar and a foundation? Foundation, right? A foundation of a building, and then the pillars they hold up the roof, I guess you could say, and that's the truth, right? So it's not that the church is the truth itself, right? It's that the church is its role is to hold it up, is to be that lampstand, right? Don't hide the lamp in the bush or something like that. It needs to be a beacon. It needs to be a lighthouse, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
That says, hey, here it is. You might think the truth is all these other places. No, it's right here.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I think why, because your lay leaders might forget, right, that is part of the task of the church, right? So you can be doing other things, right? But if you are not a bearer of divine truths, then pretty much you're probably not really doing anything significant in relation to God's kingdom, right? Because part of what you're supposed to do is the preservation of that truth and pass it on to other people, so that they can have changed lives, they can have changed perspectives, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing as a church. Now, becoming a lay leader, I think you need to know something about the truths that the church is actually standing for, right? Um, the next question here I want to ask is, so what, uh, what should be, right? What should basic theological education for lay leaders be? I mentioned to you a while ago what I have in mind, and then let me say it, and then I will let you respond to it. Um, what I have in mind is that I think if you wanted to pursue basic theological education as a lay leader, there are actually four, things that you need to formally study. If you can informally study it, that's fine, right? You can do all of this just by reading books and studying it yourself, right? But usually you might need some kind of motivation, right? Or you might need some kind of guidance, because these are very complex issues, right? So one course that I think you have to have, right, as part of your basic theological education as a lay leader, is of course a course in theology. Okay, usually in I don't know if it's called systematic theology for Catholics, but I think you guys sometimes, I think the Jesuits probably call it systematic theology as well. So like some kind of a systematic theology class. Now, what is a systematic theology class? It is, you know, a class where you talk about different topics or major topics that have something to do with the major teachings of the church. Major teachings about God, right? The nature of God. Major teachings about what is the nature of the church. What is the nature of, how should we view the Bible? Is it inerrant, or is it somehow, does it have some errors but ignorable errors, right? So these are things that you study in systematic theology. So you study theological anthropology, right? What is a human being, right, in relation to scripture and Christian tradition? What about the last days, right? What should we believe about eschatology, right? The doctrine of the last days. What should we believe about, the doctrine of salvation? How does one gain salvation? And so Catholics and Protestants have very different views about that. And so you study these things, right? And so what it does, it tries to give systematic answers, right, to those questions about what we should believe about such and such. And so, for example, conservative evangelicals have a tendency to just simply look at biblical text, right, and try to harmonize them, right? They try to look for Bible verses here, Bible verses there, and they try to put them all together to actually construct some kind of a teaching, right, on, I don't know, salvation, right? I don't agree that it should be done in that way. I'm just saying that that's how evangelicals actually try to do it, right? And so, but you need to know, right, what we should believe, okay? It's because systematic theology provides the framework for how you're supposed to read the scriptures, in some sense. Okay, it gives you some kind of a interpretive framework, and then after that, you need to have a course, of course, in the Old Testament. Now, whether you like it or not, the Old Testament remains to be relevant today, right? Part of the complete Word of God, right, actually includes the Old Testament. So you need to learn, about the cultural backgrounds, right, of the Old Testament. You need to learn, I know, the language, right? Not necessarily if you're a lay leader, right? But you just need to learn at least the cultural background, the literary background. What kind of work is Lamentations, right? What kind of work is Psalms? Because I think the genre can tell you how you're supposed to read it, right? If it's poetry, you're not going to read it as if it's in a way, the way you will read a historical narrative, right? If it is a historical narrative and you read it poetically, right, then you're probably what? You're going to be misled, right? You're not going to really understand how it should be supposed to be interpreted, right? So you need to learn about the Old Testament. And then, of course, after that, you need to have a course in the New Testament, right? And the same thing, you need to learn the cultural background, the literary background, right, of the different books in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. You need to learn the context, because you cannot really understand biblical passages correctly independently of the context. That's why I think it is important for lay leaders to at least understand how to read the New Testament. How to read the Gospel, how to read the Book of Acts, right? Usually, like I've seen a lot of people, try to use the Book of Acts in order to draw doctrinal claims, right? But I think, you have to read it as a narrative. You have to read it as if someone is just relaying, conveying some kind of a narrative of what happened during that time. Whether there's something authoritative about that or not, I think that might be debatable. So what kind of literature is Revelation, right? Apocalyptic literature. It's a prophetic literature, right? But you have to understand, right? Who was the audience right, of the author of Revelation. I am under the impression here that the book of Revelation really has to do with first century Christian experiences, right? It is a way of responding to the Roman Empire, right? But of course, some people will actually read it differently. Now, so you need to learn how to do all of this, right? At least if you're a lay leader, you need to have some kind of a basic understanding on how you're supposed to read the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then lastly, I think you need to learn church history. Protestants are not as good as Catholics when it comes to church history, right? But I think Catholics have a much deeper appreciation for church history. But you need to learn church history because church history will allow you to see, how um, or the effects, the impact of theological discussions, right? Biblical passages, um, the history of how people interpreted the teachings of the church. Now, I think there's something enriching about learning about the church history. You begin to learn that there is actually, so much diversity in Christianity, even from its very beginning. And if you fail to understand that, you might misread the Bible. You might have an incomplete, um, theological reflection, right? Without understanding church history, you have to understand that doctrines of the church developed historically, right? Like, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity didn't just like, pop into existence out of the blue, right? It was actually something that was constructed in response to some heretical teachings, right? The dual nature of Christ was constructed. Why? Because they were responding to, right, some heretical teachings of some church leaders of the first 3 centuries, right? Something like that, right? So you need to learn. You need to learn, what happened during the Protestant Reformation, right? In what sense that is relevant as a response to probably some of the abuses in the Catholic Church in Germany, let's say, right? And then probably you need to learn about, I don't know, theologians in South America, right? About, I don't know, how dealing with the problems of the oppressed and the poor, right, somehow shaped the way they actually understood, right, the Bible, right? From Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian priest, let's say, right, and some other Miguel Bonino, right, a Protestant liberation theologian, right. So when you study this history, then you begin to understand this kind of stuff, right. You begin to understand, the rise of Pentecostalism in the 20th century, and how that pretty much conquered the world in some sense because it became one of the fastest growing group, right? Are the Pentecostals. Um, and so you learn all of this stuff, right? When you study church history, and I think that those are important because it gives you a larger picture of what went on, right, in Christianity with its 2,000 years history, let's say. I don't know. You wanted to say something about that? Sorry if that took me a while to unpack.
No, that's fine.
Mm,
I agree with a lot of things that
mm,
that you said. I think so. I wrote down some things here. So as you were speaking, I thought, what the things that you were outlining are basically the outline of every Catholic catechism that I've come across.
mm,
You could look at the Catechism, the Council of Trent, which was ordered by the Council of Trent after the Protestant Reformation, right? So you have the Catechism that's been around for 4 centuries, right? And you could still buy a copy in today's English. And then you have the Universal Catholic Catechism that came out in 1992 and revised in, I think, 94. Actually, even recently revised by Francis. He had the catechism revised related to capital punishment. because of his, understanding of it being probably immoral in today's context. So that's debatable, I would say, whether or not that's legitimate for him to change the catechism on that level. But anyway, every catechism, those two that I mentioned, you have the Baltimore Catechism, which was popular for almost a century here in the or actually not almost a century, but anyway, it's still popular today. It's the basic thing that every Catholic was taught in the 1960s, the Baltimore, and you have the number one, level two, level three. So it grows in its depth as you age, right?
Mhm.
So, but it touches on the same questions. But how those catechisms are usually formulated? It starts off with the articles of the Apostles' Creed. So the Apostles' Creed has 12 articles of faith, is what we call it. And so the catechisms usually answer questions that relate to those 12 statements and articles of the Apostles' Creed. And we say that aligns, it's nice that it's 12 articles because it aligns with the 12 apostles, right? That's why we call it the Apostles' Creed. And then you have the Our Father. So it goes through every, sort of theological statement in the Our Father, right? Mm-hmm. And then it goes into the seven sacraments, and all the questions that relate to the theological questions that relate to those sacraments. And then in times you'll go into the four last things, or the four last things are sort of interspersed throughout the addressing of the other three things that I mentioned: Apostles' Creed, Our Father, and the sacraments. So, but what I was flipping through here as you were speaking was I reached over for this book, The Teachings of the Church Fathers by Willis. So it's from the 1960s, I think it was, but it's been reprinted over the years. And I was flipping through it. It's basically a compendium of church father statements that support doctrines that we were talking about, the Trinity, the role of the church, the four last things, which is what you're talking about, eschatological, what is it? Death, judgment, heaven and hell is what we call what Catholics call the four last things. And that usually gets focused on in the period of Lent, in the liturgical season of Lent, the 40 days, once a year for that Catholics practice. There's a lot of preaching on the four last things because the whole idea is to recall our wretchedness, our sinfulness prior to the coming of Christ, and of course culminating in Good Friday and then Easter Sunday, the victory over death, over sin, original sin and actual sin, and things like that. So, I agree with most of everything that you said. It's very important to have that systematic, because it's not, like I mentioned earlier about apologetics. If you're just directing yourself, I think that's the problem in general, even in psychology, in my field of expertise, I guess you could say, is that we have a tendency of wanting to go to self-help. We go to the bookstore and we go to the aisle that's self-help, and we choose the books we want. And then we open up that book and then we skip the chapters that are uncomfortable to us. And we focus in on the chapters that are either affirming of us or comfortable to us. And right. And, but that's the flaw, or that's the problem with, we don't make a lot of spiritual progress when we are regulating ourselves. So oftentimes what we need is that almost like a friend, right? So which kind of friend would you rather have? You have a lot of friends, right? You can keep the friends that just kind of boost you up and encourage you no matter if you're making the wrong decisions. They're always affirming you and all this other stuff. But the real friend that you really need is the friend that holds a mirror to you, right? That warts and all is going to be there through thick and thin, but is there to say, hey, you're going around the wrong path. So somehow you need that spiritual good friend that's going to hold that spiritual mirror to ourselves and say, hey, you might be Christ-like in all these other areas, but here's where the spotlight really needs to be, because that's where we're falling short. And sometimes we can't see that in ourselves. We have blinders. And so that's I think that's the function of a spiritual leader, then is, especially the pastor or the priest or whatever, is to hold that spiritual mirror to say that you need to work on these things. And by extension, I think these lay leaders, if they're going to be leaders among the lay folks, are an extension of that, I think, somehow.
Mhm.
Maybe not as an authority figure, but as a peer who's leading other peers, who's leading other, or I should say, the more senior folks
Yeah.
that are leading the novices or leading, even in psychology, you have what's called, what do you call it? Scaffolding, right? Or
Mhm.
you have in Vygotsky's theory of sociocultural development, what you have are role models in the community that have mastered the craft, have mastered education or mastered mathematics, and they're there to then be role models. So you have, how that's applied in child development is you have maybe third graders that are assigned to second graders that are, because they're experts in things of second grade already, they're already in third grade, they're role models, and the second graders look up to them and they say, I want to be like that third grader. So what do I need to be? And then the third grader has, it helps them too, because then they have that sense of pride, like, oh, I'm helping someone.
You got cut off.
So in that same way, I think that's
Mhm.
the spiritual role of the lay leader.
Yeah. No, you're right. So I think there's not that much. Um, I'm trying to think of, but probably the requirements about what the kind of theological formation that one should have, right? Very similar between Catholics and Protestants. Probably the kind of knowledge that a lay leader must have, right? It's probably very similar, right? What we can require of them, theologically speaking, right? And and this might be, I don't know if you might want to answer this, but in in Protestantism, right? If you're asking for institutions that can provide theological education, of course we have Bible institutes, Bible colleges, seminaries, but you don't have to necessarily go to a seminary, right, to get this basic theological education. Probably taking courses, right, here and there, right, in Bible colleges and seminaries that might, or in Christian colleges, that might actually help. I know that in some seminaries like Fuller, they have what they call certificate program. So you're not getting a degree, right? But you can get like a certificate in theological essentials, right? And then you can just take the four classes that I mentioned: systematic theology, right? Old Testament, New Testament, and church history, and you get a certificate at the end, right? You don't get that's not like an actual degree, right? But at least you get a certificate, and then you gain uh you know um some understanding that might be adequate, right, in order for you to be part of the lay leadership of a church. Okay. And then but I wanted to ask this question. That's the last question I'm going to ask, and I wanted Laurence to actually answer this. What are the things that those who pursue theological education must watch out for? And does theological education corrupt one's faith? Because that's the worries of some people, right? That when you pursue theological education, that will somehow automatically or necessarily, right, corrupt your faith. I don't know if that's true of Catholics, right? That some of them
Mm.
also think that way. But I know in conservative evangelicalism, many people tend to think that way. Okay.
Just briefly, could you repeat the first part of that question, or
The
at
first
least
part of
both
the question is, what are the things that those who pursue theological education must watch out for,
Oh, okay.
right? But the second question is the one that seems to clarify that. Or does theological education corrupt one's faith, right? Because usually the complaint, right, is that if you attend seminary, right,
Mm,
that it will just damage your spiritual formation, right?
right. Um, so my observation, at least from a Catholic context,
Mhm.
is I think what, and this is someone who didn't go to theology school or anything like that, right? So this is just kind of my observation. Is I think just like secular university, and maybe you can affirm this or not or whatever in your observation of academia, is there might be, the purpose of university, back in the days, obviously for the discovery of truth, right? We're trying to figure out what's the truth, right?
Mhm.
And so you have these individuals who have this passion for truth, and how my understanding of how the university was founded was in pubs, right? People would come together like experts in their field. They would come to the pubs, have a drink, and they would start debating about issues about truth from their various perspectives, right? From an anthropological perspective, from a biological perspective. No, it's this. No, it's this. And somehow there's some intersection among the different fields, and where they come, where they where they connect is where the debate lies, right? Because then you can get, from the different perspectives, you can start fine tuning and trying to find commonality, with, among the fields, or agreement, I should say. And if you're not in agreement, then you're trying to get there. So I think the same thing with, I think, well, okay, going back to the problem I find is that it's no longer that. It's no longer wisdom, right? It's no longer philosophia, right? It's no longer a love of wisdom. It's now funding and publishing, and but publish or perish is the phrase I used to hear, right, in academia. So I'm pretty sure that's the same thing in theology, is that you have this pressure to want to discover something new, or to have the next great book or whatever it is, and the focus isn't necessarily always truth. It's becoming well known and being published and being, and that's important. And I suppose that's important for the love of your craft, but I don't know if that's maybe what's polluting. Again, to be more specific, there are authors in the Catholic world, I think, that it's like their books that are published is like a fresh take on Paul. Why do I need a fresh take on Paul? How about, I mean, if I, like, let's say I'm a layperson and I'm a dum-dum, no, I know nothing already. I don't need a fresh take on Paul. I need the traditional take on Paul first, I would say. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, if I don't have the traditional take on Paul for the first 2,000 years, why would I start off with the new, a new perspective, or a new, um, because then you have no sort of grid by which to judge the new ideas, because you don't have the foundations set. So I guess it goes back to the systematic theology part of it. So does that corrupt faith? I don't know. Faith is a gift. So if you have faith, then you have faith, and it comes from God. It's not something that I generate. It's not something that I do, right? So it's a gift that comes from God. So if something that, if I, anything that I do in life, because of the choices I make, stands to potentially corrupt my faith or lead me astray. It could be secular ideas. It could be my academics. It could be, right? So, I mean, is it possible that a person in seminary is so overwhelmed with tests and papers or whatever that they neglect their prayer life, that they stop going to church or whatever it is because they got a paper due? In which case, you have priorities in the wrong place. If it's not first the relationship you have with God, um, that becomes secondary to your papers that you're doing or you're studying for your exam. I don't know. So I don't know if that's answering your question
Yeah, yeah.
or
But
not.
I think I don't know if there's a correct answer to that question. Anyways, I just think that, of course, it should be expected that the more you go deeper in your theological formation, that your mind becomes more critical, right? Your mind becomes, more sophisticated. Now you begin to see nuances, right, that you probably didn't see before. You begin to see, um, that there are many other plausible perspectives that you can use to view a certain point, right? In the past, you probably just have one way of looking at things. Now you have 12 ways of looking at things, right? And that should be welcomed, right? That should be found as deeply enriching, right? Because it enriches your knowledge of something. So after, when you go through theological education, I think you should be expected to form some doubts. But doubts are actually good, a part of spiritual formation. You know, so for example, even Mother Teresa claimed to have gone through, this periods of doubts. I think she said that in her autobiography or something like that. And even Billy Graham, right, has to go through, some periods of doubt. His partner in the ministry actually became an atheist, Charles Templeton, who was supposedly a much more talented evangelist than Billy Graham. But after he pursued theological education, Billy Graham pursued theological education. Billy Graham stayed, but Charles Templeton left. Right. And I think that's something that should be expected. Of course, it's risky, right? There's a risk that you have to take, but you're better off, right, with having clearer understanding of things, right, and still probably end up with some doubts, right, than not having to doubt at all, right, but the whole time you're just biasedly, you're looking at things in a very prejudiced way, in a biased way, right, and somehow you were not able to escape your biases, right, you were not able to escape your prejudices. That's the reason why you do theological education. You expand your mind, right, so that you will be set free from all those things that are preventing you, right, from seeing things in different ways. So I know Lawrence and I are coming here from some very different perspective here, because Lawrence is a much more conservative, I think, than me when theologically speaking, right? But I think there's something beneficial about theological education. Of course, there are risks that you need to take. Some people end up doubting. Some people ended up becoming an atheist after pursuing theological education, right? But doubting and leaving the faith is not a necessary byproduct or automatic byproduct of theological education. Majority of people who study theology, right, they still become pastors, they become teachers, right, they become, so they stay in the faith, right. Many of them, right, stay in the faith, because so I don't think one should see some kind of a correlation between the corruption of the faith and the pursuit of theological education, right, although it's a risky thing. I know that, but I think those are risks worth taking, because if you are intellectually honest, right, you would want to pursue, you will want to know more things, okay. And yeah. So I think if you are intellectually honest, you would want to know more things, right? You want to pursue, you want to understand more things, you want to understand deeply, because that's helpful for you. And there's nothing to be scared. If divine truths are divine truths, it's supposed to be confirmed by what you will actually discover as you pursue your theological education. If it turns out that it's not confirming it, probably there's just things here that you don't see, right? Or probably it will actually lead you to the actual truth, right? Probably the whole time, people are mistaken about what they're believing in. So that's a possibility, right? And so don't be scared, right? Because I think if you're intellectually honest, you would want to actually achieve the truth or pursue the truth. And so, yeah, so I hope that's a helpful conversation. I know, it's very difficult to gauge, what sorts of conversations will actually help, right, certain people, right? But I hope that some people were actually helped by this discussion. I don't know if you want to say a last word here, Lawrence, before we go.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking, I think that you made the point pretty clear,
Mm,
and we probably know it intuitively, but we'd like to think it's, if somebody loses faith,
mm,
whatever that might mean,
mm,
whatever we mean when we describe a person's journey in that way, that it's not always for lack of knowledge,
mm,
because like you said, you can have these two individuals, one's even seemingly more prestigious or seemingly more has a higher acumen for preaching and the knowledge of the faith, and yet leaves the faith, right? So it's not for lack of knowledge always.
mm,
Again, faith, I mean, from a Catholic perspective, is a gift, and that's the mystery, right? So you can't tell just by externals whether a person is saved, is the elect from biblical, even biblical, what we see in the biblical narrative. You can't always tell, because you see an individual and you can see externally they seem to be going in this trajectory, and then before you know it, they do a total 180,
mhm,
right? But even then, that total 180, it's we would say it's for the glory, for the glory of God. Somehow it's part of, there is some function of that individual's going that direction. Maybe, yeah, at least for me, like in my own, like sometimes for me, like getting to hearing the story of someone who loses faith, oddly enough, strengthens my own.
mhm,
I don't know if that makes sense,
mhm,
but at least it makes sense to me somehow. Like in the fact that I might look at that person's life and I say, I've gone through similar situations, and yet I maintain somehow.
mhm,
And I would say, by the grace of God, that I maintain. For whatever reason, for whatever reason, that person does not, and despairs. I might be able to pray for that person, but if they continue in that in that despairing pathway, I mean, all I can say is, for me, all glory to God that by the grace of God, I still maintain my path.
mhm.
But and maybe that's by design. And so I don't lose my own faith because I see other people losing their faith. If anything, sometimes it strengthens my faith, and that might be the very function of why those individuals have lost faith. Whatever, I don't know,
Yeah.
but I don't lose sleep over it. So will more knowledge and getting an MDiv, or getting some kind of theology degree or certificate, necessarily mean that individuals going to grow in faith and strengthen their faith? Not necessarily, like we already discussed. So, but if you're moved to do so, you just keep going. You just move, wherever the Spirit leads you. I would just say, just go with it.
Mhm.
I don't know if,
No,
if
that's
anything
good.
was meaningful of what I said.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. I think one of the reasons why, like what I said a while ago, that I did this is to actually help some members of our church, and I hope it will help some other people as well, right? Who are contemplating on, how can I become, a theologically formed lay leader of the church, right? And there are things that you can do, and I think it's not difficult, right? Taking these courses, reading books about theology, about the Bible, about church history, right, will actually help you out. Now you can actually just go YouTube, right? You can watch so much stuff on biblical interpretation, systematic theology, church history, and you can learn from those things. Yeah, assuming that those are reliable sources of information, but I think yeah. So there are other ways that are available to people today, especially right now. I think probably it's the best time to get some kind of basic theological education from seminaries, because a lot of them are now offering online courses. So you don't have to actually leave, right? If you're not going to be a theologian, or Bible scholar, then you don't need to pursue those degrees, right? But what you can do is you can just take courses, right, that will actually enrich your theological knowledge. Okay. And so thank you again for watching us. I hope that this actually helped you out. God bless you. Continue to serve God, right? Continue to study to show yourself as an approved servant of God. And that's my hope and that's my prayer for our Protestant brothers, for our Catholic brothers. Again, thank you.